Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today into the life and music of, well, a pretty legendary figure, Igor Stravinsky.
Yeah, definitely legendary.
Yeah,
He really kind of turned the music world on its head in the 20th century.
absolutely. And to help us unpack this musical revolutionary, we've got some great biographical info and some in-depth musical analysis.
And believe me, there's a lot to unpack. I mean, we're talking family drama, almost riots at premieres.
Oh, yeah.
And this constant push and pull between, sticking with tradition and just completely blowing things up.
Yeah. I think what really struck me going through the material is how Stravinsky's personal life and his music kind of like fed into each other, this constant reinvention.
Definitely. Yeah. It's fascinating. Like, where should we even begin? Maybe with those early years in Russia.
Yeah. I mean, he's born into a musical family, right?
Right.
But it seems like his relationship with music, especially with his father, was a little complicated.
It was. The sources really highlight this tension.
Yeah.
His father was this famous opera singer. But Stravinsky, he was drawn to improvisation, almost like rebelling against, like, the strict practice that his father represented.
Right. Yeah, that rebellious streak, it seems like it continued even when he meets his mentor, the composer, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Rimsky-Korsakov, he was a giant, in Russian music. But even his guidance, it couldn't really contain Stravinsky's urge to break free from all those conventions.
Yeah. And it's interesting, though, because those early works, even with like hints of that rebellion, they're still deeply rooted in those Russian musical traditions. Like you think about the Firebird, that first ballet he did for the Ballet Russes, it's full of that dazzling orchestral color, and those folk-inspired melodies.
Totally. But even within that framework, you can hear him, pushing the boundaries. The rhythms are more complex, the harmonies a little more dissonant. It's like a hint of those radical shifts that were to come.
Oh, yeah. And speaking of radical shifts, I mean, we have to talk about the Rite of Spring.
Oh, we do.
Causing a near riot at the premiere, I mean, that's a pretty good sign you've shaken things up.
It was a watershed moment.
Yeah.
The premiere of the Rite of Spring, 1913. It just changed music history. Audiences were just not ready for that raw, primal energy, those jarring rhythms, that sheer audacity of the sound, like nothing they had ever heard before.
Yeah. And from what I've read, it wasn't just the subject matter, like a pagan ritual and human sacrifice, but the music itself was challenging those like fundamental ideas about musical harmony and structure.
Exactly. Yeah, he's like dismantling those traditional ideas of melody and harmony.
Yeah.
Introducing all these irregular rhythms and dissonances. It creates this sense of like visceral, almost violent energy.
Yeah.
It's music that was meant to shock, to provoke, to confront the audience with something totally new.
So then how does he go from the exoticism of the Firebird to like this revolutionary energy of the Rite of Spring to like his next phase, that neoclassical period? And it seems like such a sharp turn.
It is fascinating, isn't it? After all that chaos and the upheaval of World War I, Stravinsky turns toward order and clarity. He's revisiting classical forms like the sonata and the concerto, but with this modern twist. It's like he's having this conversation with the past, but on his own terms.
So he's not just like imitating those old masters, he's really like reimagining them through his own unique lens.
Exactly. Like take Pulcinella, for example. It's based on this music by the Baroque composer Pergolesi, but Stravinsky infuses it with, his own rhythmic vitality, that harmonic language. It's both familiar, but then it's also startlingly new.
So this idea of like revisiting the past, but in this fresh way, it seems really central to this whole neoclassical period, right? Even when he's turning to Greek mythology, like in Oedipus Rex, he's not just retelling those old stories, he's using them as like a jumping off point, a springboard for his own musical explorations.
Right. And this period, it wasn't without its critics. Some critics thought that this move towards classicism was like a betrayal of his earlier radicalism.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. But I think it just shows how incredible his range was as a composer. His willingness to experiment, to challenge himself, and his audiences constantly.
It makes you wonder, though, if this constant reinvention, was it somehow connected to his personal life, like the biographical sources mention, this kind of complex relationship with his wife, Yekaterina, and like a growing spiritual crisis. Did those things, like those personal upheavals, fuel those artistic shifts?
That's a great question. And it's something we could definitely dig into further, as we move into like his later years. But what's clear is that Stravinsky was never content to stay in one place, musically or personally. He was always searching, always evolving, always pushing the boundaries of what music could be.
So we've seen Stravinsky go from like embracing that Russian folklore to shattering musical convention. with the Rite of Spring, to revisiting the past with a modernist sensibility. And this is all before he even hits his stride in the later part of his career. So, where do we go from here? So we left off with Stravinsky, like really deep into his neoclassical period, right? Revisiting all those old forms, but with that modern twist. But the world around him, it was changing, like super rapidly.
Yeah.
There's a war brewing in Europe, and he's about to start a whole new chapter, one that takes him across the Atlantic.
Yeah, that's right. In 1939, right when World War II breaks out, he leaves Europe. And he ends up settling in the United States. I mean, it was a huge shift for him, geographically and, like, culturally.
I can't even imagine going from, like, the center of that European avant-garde scene to landing in Hollywood. I mean, that's got to be a culture shock.
Oh, it was a huge change, for sure. And on top of that, the war, it cuts off all of his income from those European royalties. So he's facing financial struggles, that he'd never even, like, experienced before. Stravinsky, the composer who once epitomized artistic revolution, he's having to write, like, commercial pieces for films and Broadway just to make ends meet.
That's got to be a humbling experience for someone of his stature.
Yeah.
Did that shift, like, affect his music at all?
It's interesting. You see how he adapts to this new environment. Even in those commercial works, his voice, it shines through.
Mm-hmm.
But I think more importantly, America, it opens him up to new influences, new people to work with, and ultimately a whole new direction musically.
And that's where the conductor Robert Craft comes into the picture, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Craft becomes much more than just a conductor for Stravinsky,
Yeah.
He's a friend, someone Stravinsky can confide in, a guide through that whole American cultural landscape. And, like, crucially, he's the one who introduces Stravinsky to that whole world of serial music, the music of Schoenberg and Webern.
Right. This is the 12-tone technique.
Yeah.
Right. We touched on it a bit earlier. That's that system where the composer uses all 12 notes of that chromatic scale in a specific order, a row, before repeating any of them. I've read that Stravinsky, he was actually kind of skeptical of serialism at first. It seemed a little too, like, rigid, too mathematical maybe for a composer who, like, thrived on that rhythmic freedom and instinct.
Yeah, that's true. His first reaction was hesitant. He saw the potential there, but he felt like it lacked, like, the rhythmic vitality, something that he really prized, However, just like with everything Stravinsky did, he didn't just dismiss it. He studied it, like, intensely, wrestled with, all those complexities, and then ultimately he found a way to make it his own.
So instead of just, like, adopting Schoenberg's method wholesale, he finds a way to integrate it into his own distinct style.
Exactly. You can hear this evolution in, like, works like In Memoriam Dylan Thomas. It's his piece for tenor and chamber ensemble. And then there's Canticum Sacrum, which is this monumental work for voices and orchestra. He's using the 12-tone system as a framework, but then he infuses it with his own, rhythmic inventiveness and that dramatic flair.
But did this embrace of serialism, did it alienate any of his, like, longtime fans, the people who loved that, like, wild, unpredictable Stravinsky of, the Rite of Spring?
There was definitely a mixed reaction, yeah. Some critics thought it was like a betrayal of his earlier style, too intellectual, too abstract. But others, they recognized it as, like, a natural progression. For a composer who is always pushing those boundaries, it's a testament to this constant desire to learn, to evolve, and, like, challenge himself.
Yeah, it's that constant reinvention that really makes Stravinsky such a fascinating figure. He never let himself get complacent or get stuck in a rut.
Right.
He embraced change, even when it meant, like, risking criticism or even, like, alienating his audience.
And it wasn't just change, like, for the sake of changing. Stravinsky was really deeply engaged with, like, all the intellectual and artistic currents of his time. He was reading, a ton, debating with other artists and composers. He was always absorbing all these new ideas and then finding ways to put them into his work.
That intellectual curiosity, it seems like it extended beyond music, too. Didn't he collaborate with, like, some of the most important artists of the 20th century?
Oh, absolutely. Like, his work with the ballet Russes, it brought him into contact with, like, these groundbreaking choreographers, people like Vaslav Nijinsky and George Balanchine. And then he even collaborated with artists like Pablo Picasso on, sets and costumes.
Wow.
And these collaborations, they weren't just about, like, bringing different art forms together. They were about pushing the boundaries of what art could even be.
Yeah, it sounds like he, like, really thrived on these creative partnerships, on that cross-pollination of ideas. It's a reminder that, like, great art rarely exists in a vacuum.
Mm,
It's often the result of dialogue, collaboration, a willingness to embrace like different perspectives.
exactly. And it's through those collaborations that, like, Stravinsky's impact
Yeah.
goes way beyond, like, classical music. His rhythmic innovations, how he boldly used dissonance, the theatricality of it all, it's all there in film scores, jazz, even rock music. He left this, like, indelible mark on the soundscape of the whole 20th century.
We've talked about Stravinsky, the composer, the innovator, the collaborator, but what about Stravinsky, the man? Can we even separate the art from the artist, especially given like how complex his personal life was?
That's a question that people still debate today, you know?
Yeah.
His relationships, his religious beliefs, his political views, is all intertwined with his music in, like, really complex ways.
Right. And we know his relationship with his wife, Yekaterina, was strained. Yeah.
Even though they had a long marriage. And he later married Vera de Beausset, who he had, like, a long affair with.
Yeah.
And then there was this, like, deep spiritual crisis that led him back to, like, the Russian Orthodox faith.
It did, yeah. And all of these experiences, they like undoubtedly shaped his artistic vision, you know? We see it in the religious themes that pop up in those later works, and that emotional depth and introspection of pieces like Symphony of Psalms and Threnin. But in the end, it's really up to each listener to like grapple with how all these personal elements affect like their understanding of his music.
So even as Stravinsky's, like, embracing serialism, collaborating with all these leading artists and, like, grappling with these personal struggles, he's still, like, this restless, driven figure.
Mhm.
Did he ever slow down?
Not really. He keeps composing, conducting, touring well into his 80s, even as his health is, you know, starting to decline.
Yeah.
In fact, there's this like remarkable event that happens in 1962.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, after decades of like being in exile, Stravinsky gets invited back to his homeland.
To the Soviet Union for the first time since the Russian Revolution.
Wow. That must have been like incredibly emotional. His music had been banned in the Soviet Union for years.
Right.
What was the reception like?
It was this, like, triumphant return. He conducts 6 performances in Moscow and Leningrad, and he's meeting with, you know, all the top Soviet composers like Dmitri Shostakovich. It's a moment of reconciliation. It's this, like, recognition of how hugely influential he was, even in this country that had, like, rejected him once.
Yeah, it's almost like closing a circle, like a final acknowledgement of like his place in music history.
It really does feel that way. And even after that, like, whirlwind trip, Stravinsky's creative fire,
Yeah.
it just doesn't go out. He keeps composing, pushing boundaries right until the very end.
So what were those final years like? Did he finally find like peace, a sense of resolution?
It really is incredible to think, like, after a lifetime of this groundbreaking work, he was still pushing forward in his final years. Did he ever, like, find a sense of contentment? You know, like, he had achieved everything he wanted to do. That's tough to say. Stravinsky was, like, famously complex. A man of, you know, contradictions. He could be arrogant and demanding, but then also deeply spiritual, introspective.
Mm-hmm.
He craved recognition, but he never seemed, like, totally satisfied, you know?
Yeah.
In those later years, he starts focusing on those smaller scale works, refining his serial technique in pieces like The Flood and then Abraham and Isaac.
It makes me think of Picasso, you know? He kept evolving and experimenting even in his 90s. Like these titans of 20th century art, they just never lost that drive to create, to like explore new possibilities.
Yeah, it's a testament to, you know, their curiosity, which was insatiable. And so this deep-seated belief in, like, the power of art to challenge us, to provoke us, to illuminate us. You know, for Stravinsky music, it was way more than just entertainment. It was a force that could shape, you know, how we understand the world, our relationship to, like, time and space.
Yeah, and we've seen that throughout his career, right? From those primal rhythms of the Rite of Spring to the like introspective beauty of Symphony of Psalms to those intricate structures of his serial works. It's like he was always searching for these new ways to express the human experience, but through sound.
And he wasn't afraid to, you know, challenge audiences, to make them uncomfortable even, to force them to really confront, like, their own preconceptions about what music could even be.
Right.
That takes courage.
Yeah.
You know, a willingness to risk being rejected, but in the pursuit of, like, this artistic truth.
You've mentioned that his music, it still really resonates with audiences today. But what about his influence on other composers? Like, do we hear his echoes in contemporary music?
Well, absolutely. His rhythmic innovations, how bold he was using dissonance, how masterful he was with orchestration. Those elements are all there, you know, in the works of composers from Leonard Bernstein to Pierre Boulez to Philip Glass. And his impact goes way beyond just classical music. You can hear traces of Stravinsky in jazz, in film scores, even like rock music.
It's amazing to think about like how broad his legacy really is. He started by drawing inspiration from, Russian folk traditions, then shattered all those expectations with the Rite of Spring. He embraced neoclassicism, explored serialism, and then collaborated with some of the most like visionary artists of his time. It's almost impossible to like sum up such a multifaceted career.
I think what ties it all together is that relentless pursuit of innovation. That refusal to be confined by like genre, by convention, by expectations. Stravinsky was like a true original, a composer who never stopped evolving, never stopped pushing the boundaries of what music could be.
So if someone was just starting to explore Stravinsky's music, like where would you recommend they begin?
Oh, that's a tough one. There's like so much to choose from. I guess if they want to experience like the sheer visceral power of his early work, The Rite of Spring is a must. It's still just as shocking and thrilling today as it was like over a century ago.
And for someone who wants to hear that blend of like Russian folklore and like a modernist sensibility.
Petrushka, I think, is a great choice. It's a ballet full of color, energy, and pathos, with a story that like explores themes of love, loss, and the search for identity.
What about his neoclassical period? Any recommendations there?
Symphony of Psalms, it's like a masterpiece from that era.
Yeah.
It's a deeply moving and, spiritual work. It showcases how great he was with choral writing and like his ability to evoke a sense of like profound transcendence through music.
And then finally, for someone who wants to like delve into those serial works.
Aegon is a great place to start. The ballet score that combines, the precision and the rigor of 12-tone technique with like Stravinsky's signature rhythmic vitality and, dramatic flair.
This deep dive into Stravinsky's life and music has been like a whirlwind, innovation, controversy, and like enduring brilliance. It's clear that he wasn't just a composer, he was like a force of nature, someone who reshaped like the whole musical landscape of the 20th century.
And his legacy, it continues to, challenge us and inspire us. His music reminds us that art can be a powerful force for change. It's a way to confront our fears, expand our horizons, and like connect with something that's, larger than ourselves.
So to our listeners, we encourage you to like dive into the world of Stravinsky, listen with open ears, let his music, wash over you, and discover for yourself the power and the beauty of like this extraordinary composer's work.
And as you listen, like ask yourself, what does his music make you feel? How does it like challenge how you think about music? And how does his legacy, continue to shape the sounds of our world today?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's like sparked some curiosity to explore Stravinsky's music further and, to have your own conversations about music. Until next time, keep listening, keep exploring, and keep the music playing.